The bride who ran away from the altar and was retrieved 20 years later. Have you ever imagined running away from the altar and 20 years later discovering that the promise you left behind is still alive? She abandoned her fiancé in front of everyone, and that same night he was found dead in a mysterious accident. The case seemed buried until 2 decades later, a letter arrived in the mail. The signature? From the fiancé who should never have written another word. The note ended with a sentence that would chill any heart. You still have a promise with me. Get ready to experience one of the darkest and most disturbing stories you've ever heard. If you like real mysteries, dark legends, and stories of promises that not even death can erase, then leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. Because today you will discover the fate of the bride who ran away from the altar, but was found 20 years later. That was the day that was supposed to mark a new beginning. The church was lit by hundreds of candles. Flowers decorated every corner with their sweet scent, and the guests filled the pews, eager for the moment when the wedding march would announce the bride's triumphant entrance. The groom, in an impeccable dark suit, stood firm before the altar, but his eyes betrayed anxiety. He couldn't stop looking at the door, waiting for the moment she would appear. But the minutes stretched on. First, a slight delay that seemed normal, then nervous, murmuring among those present, and finally, a heavy silence when it became clear she wouldn't be entering. Backstage, the bride trembled. Her white dress weighed more than any chain. Her heart was at war, her chest suffocating with a mixture of fear and despair. There was no doubt about the love he felt for her, but there was something about her that couldn't be reciprocated. Some speak of insecurity, others of a strange feeling, as if this marriage was wrong from the very beginning. She herself couldn't explain it. She only knew she couldn't take the step that seemed inevitable to everyone. And then he fled. She left through the side door of the church, still in her impeccable dress, her shoes stumbling on the stone floor, tears blurring her vision. With every step, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes following her, even though she was already alone. Inside the church, the groom stood still, staring at the door that never opened. Guests tried to console him, family members ran after the bride, but nothing broke the image of him standing motionless, as if he already knew that this moment would change everything. That same night, tragedy struck. The groom was found dead in a car accident a few blocks away. Officially, he lost control of the vehicle, but witnesses swore he seemed distraught, like someone who no longer wanted to live. Some said it was a desperate act, that he couldn't bear the humiliation, nor the feeling of being abandoned in front of everyone. The funeral took place days later in a tense and silent atmosphere. Many blamed the bride, while others defended her, saying she had simply followed her intuition. But for everyone, the tragedy marked that date with the shadow of incompleteness, and for her, the eternal weight of a broken promise remained. Running away from the altar not only changed her life, it seemed to have altered his destiny as well, as if the thread connecting them had been brutally, but not definitively, severed. What one imagined was that 20 years later, that thread would resurface, and the promise unspoken that night would exact its price. After the accident, her life was never the same. Running away from the altar would have been a heavy burden in itself. But the cruel fate of seeing her fiancé dead just hours later transformed that burden into an invisible chain that would follow her for decades. Still, time, with its relentless force, dragged the days forward. She left the city. She could no longer bear to walk the streets where everyone looked at her with a mixture of judgment and pity. She carried on her back the whispers that haunted her. It was she who killed him with sadness, they said. He moved away, started over, remarried, and started a family. At first glance, it seemed like he'd buried that chapter, but the silence held secrets. At night, when everyone was asleep, she found herself thinking about him. Not the man he once was, but the frozen moment of her last memory. His gaze, fixed on the altar waiting for a bride who never came. It was as if that scene had been etched in her mind, like a photograph that time could not erase. She avoided talking about the past, even with her new husband. If they asked about her life before, she answered with short, evasive sentences. Deep down, however, she knew she hadn't overcome anything. She had simply pushed it away, trying to convince herself it wouldn't come back. But the signs never completely stopped. On some wedding, anniversaries, she dreamed of white flowers wilting before her eyes. Other nights, she woke with the feeling that someone was watching her from the corner of the room. Whenever she heard wedding marches in movies or at acquaintances' weddings, a vertigo would overcome her, as if she were about to fall back into that same church, her dress clinging to her skin and her heart begging to escape. Still, she lived. She raised children, worked, and built a facade of normalcy. But deep inside, there was always the feeling that the past wasn't buried. It was just waiting to be unearthed. This silence of the years was treacherous. There were no visible ghosts, no apparitions, only the memory that refused to die, like a spirit that hadn't left because it still had something to pay. She believed that time would protect her, that 20 years would be enough to erase any bond. But time, in truth, has only strengthened the shadow. For what is unfinished does not disappear. It ripens in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to return. And when it finally returned, it wasn't in the form of a dream nor a vague memory. It was in words, written in a letter that spanned 2 decades to remind her that what had been interrupted wasn't yet over. It was an ordinary morning. The sun streamed timidly through the kitchen window, and the kettle hissed on the stove as she made coffee. Nothing suggested that today would be the day the past would come back to find her. Among the bills, advertisements, and everyday papers, there was a strange envelope, yellowed with a worn stamp and the rough texture of time. Touching it, she felt a shiver run through her entire body, as if she had touched something that didn't belong to her. There was no sender, just his name written in a handwriting she recognized instantly, a handwriting she hadn't seen in 20 years, but one that was etched in her memory, the slant of the letters, the firmness of the lines. It was his handwriting. For a moment, he considered tearing up the letter and throwing it away, but his hands were shaking and his heart was pounding so hard it seemed to echo throughout the kitchen. He opened the envelope carefully, as if the paper might fall apart at any moment. Inside was an equally aged sheet of paper with just a few words. "You still have a promise with me." Nothing more. No explanation, no date, no details. Just that dry sentence, which seemed to span 2 decades to hit her hard. She dropped the paper onto the table, her legs weak, the air thin. For a moment she thought it was some kind of cruel joke, perhaps someone who knew her story and wanted to mock her. But when she looked again at the handwriting, her doubts disappeared. It wasn't imitation. It wasn't coincidence. This was, without a shadow of a doubt, her dead fiancé's writing. The worst part wasn't the impossibility of it all. It was the memory the words carried, a promise, something she knew deep down she'd never kept. Because promising marriage and then running away from the altar wasn't just a public humiliation, it was also a breaking of a spiritual bond, of destiny that he seemed to have refused to accept. That night, she couldn't sleep. The envelope lay on her bedside table, and she felt as if he were watching her. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined his gaze on the altar, waiting for a future that never came. And when he finally fell asleep, he discovered that the letter was not just a memory, it was a calling. For it was at that moment that the dreams began. That night, sleep came heavily, but it didn't bring rest. As soon as her eyes closed, she found herself in a familiar place, a space she'd never set foot in again, the church where she'd abandoned her fiancé 20 years ago. Everything was as it had been on her wedding day, except for one disturbing detail. There were no guests, no music, no life, only silence and the echo of footsteps that weren't hers. The altar was dimly lit, and there standing he was, The groom, still dressed in black, the white flowers in his lapel already dried and stained, as if time had cruelly passed him by. He said nothing. He didn't move. He simply extended his hand toward her, a silent gesture full of demand. The woman's heart was racing. She wanted to scream, run, wake up. But her body felt heavy, pinned to the cold stone floor. His eyes, or what must have been his eyes, gleamed in an indescribable darkness. It was as if there were no pupils, just black holes pulling her in. She woke with a start, her body covered in a cold sweat, her heart racing. She breathed heavily, looking around the room, trying to convince herself it had just been a dream. But the detail that made her shiver was something else. The room was freezing, as if all the windows were open in the dead of winter, even though they were tightly closed. The next night, the same dream returned. The same church, the same altar, the same gesture, and each time, the groom seemed a little closer, as if taking a step forward with each appearance. She began to dread the moment of sleep. She drank coffee to stay awake, but inevitably exhaustion won out, and there he was again, motionless, patient, holding out his hand. He never said anything. He never came closer than that single gesture, and yet it was enough to drive her to despair. The dreams began to affect her waking life. She woke up tired, nervous, and unable to concentrate. People around her noticed her change, but she couldn't bring herself to tell them. How could she explain that a fiancé who had died 20 years ago was visiting her night after night, demanding payment for a broken promise? Gradually, she realized something even more frightening. In her recent dreams, it wasn't just the sight of him that disturbed her, it was the sensation that the scent of the ancient church, of aged flowers and extinguished incense, lingered in her nostrils even after waking, as if the dreams were breaking through the barrier of sleep and seeping into reality. And that's how she realized the letter wasn't just a warning, it was a calling. And dreams were his way of opening the door between the two worlds. The dreams alone would be enough to drive anyone crazy. But what truly began to terrify her was when the signs stopped being just dreams and began to invade the physical world. The first morning, she woke to find a small bouquet of white flowers on her doorstep, already wilted and yellowed, like the ones she had held at her interrupted wedding 20 years earlier. There was no note, no footprints, only the sweet, funereal scent of dead flowers, which made her stomach churn. She tried to convince herself it might be a joke from someone who knew her story, but deep down she knew no one would remember the details so precisely, except him. Days later, she found the old trunk that held clothes and mementos from the past open. She swore she'd locked it with a key, but the lid was ajar, creaking slightly, and inside, on top of the pile, was her wedding dress. Not as she'd left it, but carefully folded, as if someone had taken it out, held it, felt it, and then put it back. Touching it sent a chill through her, as if the fabric still carried a strange presence. The following week, the most disturbing sign appeared. After a long shower, she emerged wrapped in towels to find the bedroom mirror fogged with steam. But what he saw written there was no accident. In large letters, drawn as if by invisible fingers, was the phrase, "You promised." She fell to her knees in front of the mirror, tears streaming, her heart nearly stopping. The note in the letter had already been devastating. The dreams had shattered her rest. But now it was undeniable. He was there, not just in memories, not just in visions. He walked through her house, touched her objects, invaded her daily life. Each sign brought not only fear, but also a demand. The bouquet, the dress, the phrase on the mirror. Everything pointed to the same thing. Her dead fiancé had not accepted the abrupt end she had imposed on him in the past. And now, 2 decades later, he was returning step by step, crossing the threshold between the world of the living and the dead to collect the debt he considered rightfully his. She began to live in constant alert. She avoided being alone, kept all the lights on, and locked doors and windows. But none of this stopped her, because what haunted her didn't come from outside. It came from the invisible bond, the broken promise, the wound opened the day she fled the altar. And the more I resisted, the stronger he seemed to become, as if every attempt to ignore him only gave his presence more power. It was at this point that he realized the past was no longer just in his mind. He had crossed over into the present, and with each new sign, it became clearer that this was just the beginning. The weight of the signs was already unbearable. With each wilted flower, each word in the mirror, each nightmare, she felt the invisible thread connecting her to the past tighten around her life like a rope. The only way out seemed to be to confront what she had always avoided, the truth about her fiancé's death. He began with silent searches. He scoured old newspapers in libraries in the city where it had all happened. The headlines were there, printed in firm, cold letters. Man dies in accident on the night he was supposed to be married. The articles reported that the car had lost control on a curve, crashing into a tree. Instant death, they said. But the details began to bother her. Some versions mentioned that he appeared to be alone in the car. Others, that he had been seen driving at high speed, distraught shortly before. And strangest of all, 2 local residents claimed that, even injured before taking his last breath, he murmured her name. She closed her eyes at this revelation. She imagined her body torn apart, her blood staining the bench, and yet the man's lips pronouncing her name, as if the only thing left in his life was the memory of her. It was a weight that no excuse, no escape could lift. Not satisfied, she decided to search the old church, now abandoned. Among the peeling walls and dust-covered pews, she still found traces of the past. Dried flowers mixed with the rubble, the remains of candles stuck to the floor. But what shook her most was discovering behind the altar a forgotten box. Inside, quietly, stored, were the rings from that day. One of them, his, bore the phrase engraved inside, "Promise until the end." It was as if fate itself had conspired to remind her that nothing had been completed. The phrase echoed within her, mingling with the words of the letter she received 20 years later. "You still have a promise with me." With each clue he uncovered, it became clearer that his death wasn't just a trivial accident. There was something more, a void, a spiritual debt that remained unpaid. And now, after 2 decades, he didn't just want to remember her. He wanted her to finish what she'd started. This investigation brought to light an uncomfortable truth. She could have moved on, built a new life. But for him, time had not passed. He was stuck on their wedding night at the bend in the road, at their last glance, and it was from there that he returned, night after night, to collect her. The nights grew heavier and heavier. Sleep no longer brought rest, only exhaustion and fear. Every time I closed my eyes, there he was, on the altar, standing still, or in the mirror, reflected in impossible places. But one stormy night, something changed. The dream wasn't like the others. She found herself in front of her own house, watching herself through the bedroom window, and beside the door stood a motionless figure, her fiancé, soaked from the rain, his black suit clinging to his body, his eyes shadowed, his skin pale as if he had just emerged from the earth. He raised his hand and knocked 3 times on the door. The sound echoed within the dream, but also outside it. She woke with her heart racing in a cold sweat as the storm raged outside. She rose, trembling, and then heard 3 knocks on the royal door. She ran to her children's room, making sure they were sound asleep. Her husband snored, oblivious to the noise. Only she seemed able to hear the insistent knocking. He gathered his courage and went into the living room. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the air had become solid. As she reached the door, she saw the handle tremble slightly, as if someone were pressing on it from outside. Her hand almost went to the latch, but something held her back. Survival instinct, or perhaps the certainty that opening it would mean not only seeing him, but welcoming him back. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. Then, Amid the sound of the rain, a low, drawn-out voice echoed from outside. "I am arriving." She backed away, stumbling over her own feet, clutching her chest to try to control her breathing. She sat there on the living room floor until dawn. When she finally summoned the courage to open the door, she found only one disturbing detail: a trail of mud in the shape of shoes on the soaked carpet. A trail that led from the street to the entrance, but never returned. After that night, he understood that the time for warnings was over. He was no longer limited to letters, signs, or dreams. He was crossing the border, getting closer and closer, and the promise he had once broken could no longer be ignored. After the night of the storm, nothing returned to normal. No matter how much she tried to convince herself it was just a figment of her imagination or fear, its presence had become a constant in her life. The house, once a refuge, now seemed like the scene of an invisible vigil. Mornings began with small signs. The coffee would go cold on its own, as if someone had blown on it. The flowers on the table would be wilted in the morning, even though they'd been bought the day before. The bathroom mirror, still foggy from the shower, repeated the same phrase in crooked, wet handwriting: "You still have a promise with me." But the nights were worse. There was no longer any peaceful sleep. Doors slammed shut, even when locked. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, always heading toward her room. Sometimes she felt the mattress dip slightly beside her, as if someone were lying down there. Her husband, oblivious, slept without noticing, but she remained motionless, eyes wide, unable to move. The climax came one morning when she woke to the feeling of cold breath on the back of her neck. She slowly turned and saw his reflection in the wardrobe mirror. Sitting on the edge of the bed, his face shadowed, but his eyes fixed on her, as if waiting for her to finally accept his presence. With each blink, the image seemed to draw closer, until she closed her eyes and prayed, desperately, begging for daybreak. Her children began to notice her change. They asked why she was always pale, why she wasn't eating properly, why she locked the doors at night. But she had no way to explain. How could she say that her dead fiancé had returned and was now walking among them, invisible, demanding what he believed was his? The scariest thing, however, wasn't just seeing it, it was hearing it. Voices whispered through the house, always repeating variations of the same phrase. "You owe me. The promise still stands. There's no point in running away." She realized he was no longer asking. He was demanding. His presence was no longer a passive specter, a distant lament. Now it was a direct, relentless demand, like an unfulfilled contract. At that moment, the woman understood there was no way out. It wasn't enough to move to another city, nor hide in another marriage, nor deny what had happened. He would find her wherever he went, because the debt wasn't material, it was spiritual. And spirits, when they want to, always find the way. There was no longer any bearing. Each night, his presence became more suffocating, more palpable, closer. Home was no longer a shelter. Dreams were becoming blurred with reality, and the phrase engraved on every mirror, every displaced object, was no longer just a reminder. It was an ultimatum. It was then that she decided to return to the place where it all began. The old church, now forgotten, remained standing in the city she had sworn never to visit again. The peeling walls, the broken stained glass windows, and the heavy silence of decades of abandonment awaited her. She took no one. She knew this was something she had to face alone, just as she had chosen alone 20 years ago to flee the altar. He entered with hesitant steps. The wood of the benches creaked, and the musty smell mingled with that of dead flowers, as if time had not erased the atmosphere of that interrupted day. And there he was. He sat at the altar like a patient groom, motionless, waiting. His black suit looked the same as on that fateful night, but marked by time, the fabric worn, the edges burned by the accident, the lapel flower dried. His face, partially obscured by shadows, still bore the features she had known, but now distorted, as if death had carved its own mark upon it. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. The silence between them was so thick, it seemed to fill every corner of the space. Then he slowly stood. His movements were slow, drawn out, but firm. He reached out as he had in every dream, but this time there was something different. The hand wasn't just a gesture, it was a call. "Now, come," he whispered, his voice hoarse, echoing in multiple directions at once. Her legs were shaking, her heart felt like it was about to explode, and yet she felt drawn. There was no longer pure fear, but a strange sense of inevitability, as if, in that moment, all the escapes, all the refusals, all the years of silence had led her here. She took a step forward, then another. Each movement seemed to tear away a fragment of her resistance. The altar was no longer just the setting for a broken wedding. It was a threshold between worlds, and before it, the bride who had fled her past found herself forced to choose, continue denying or surrender to the bond that had never been broken. The broken stained glass windows let in a faint moonlight, illuminating them both as if time had stood still. He no longer seemed a vengeful spirit. He simply seemed incomplete, waiting for his promise to finally be fulfilled. And for the first time in 20 years, she felt she wasn't facing a ghost. She was facing a destiny that had come back to claim her. That night would be remembered forever in the small town. No one knew how she found herself in the abandoned church, nor who had left the door ajar to let the cold, early morning wind into the central aisle. But what they found the next morning is still told in whispers today, like a story no one dares repeat out loud. At the altar, before the dust-covered pews, she lay, lying on her back, her face serene, almost smiling. She wore her old wedding dress, the same one that had been stored for decades in a locked trunk. No one could explain how it had ended up there, intact, nor how she had put it on alone that early morning. Beside her body lay an antique, time-worn golden wedding ring. It was the same one her groom would wear 20 years earlier. Engraved inside was the still visible phrase, "Promise until the end." Most disturbing, however, was the detail few dared to comment on. On the altar, in front of the body, there were two sets of marks in the accumulated dust. One of small feet, like hers, and the other of larger old shoes which ended right next to hers. But there were no marks of exit. Doctors said it was sudden death. The heart had simply stopped. But those present swore there was more. The atmosphere inside the church was different. The air was heavy, cold, and filled with the sweet scent of orange blossoms, the same ones that had decorated the interrupted wedding. Some even said they heard for a moment the distant notes of a wedding march, as if time had bent to allow the ceremony to finally take place. Her husband and children were devastated, unable to understand what had brought the woman there. But the town's elders, those who remembered the tragedy 20 years earlier, had no doubt. The promise had been fulfilled. The groom, who had died without hearing her "I do," had finally taken her with him to finish what had been interrupted. Some believe it was fate's justice. Others say it was simply the fulfillment of a spiritual bond that should never have been broken. And there are those who whisper that, on full moon mornings, the muffled sound of slow footsteps can still be heard inside that abandoned church, two bodies walking together down the aisle to the altar. No one dares enter after sunset, because everyone knows that although her body has been taken, the union that began and ended there no longer belongs to this world. And the phrase, engraved on the ring, echoes like a curse and a warning. Promise until the end.